Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we are back in the book of Acts. We're going to be in Acts 20, verses 3 through 12. If you've been with us, we've just come out of Romans. And so we're now um, going into the part of Acts after Paul wrote the book of Romans. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to study this chronologically. And so we'll be in Acts for a little while following Paul's visit to Jerusalem and then Rome, and then we'll just transition and keep going chronologically as we do this. But here Paul's this is Paul's final visit to Troas. It's Acts 20 verses 3 through 12. Read it real quick and look at some of the notes. He says it finishes 3, says where we stayed for 3 months. And so I should have probably put 2 in there to add that, but they had traveled down from Greece to Corinth, and they stayed here for 3 months, and we'll talk about that. He was preparing to sail back to Syria when he discovered a plot by some Jews against his life, so he decided to return through Macedonia. Several men were traveling with him. There was, and I'm going to do my best on these names like I always do. Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, and from Berea. I'm not going to try that one. And Secondus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy and Tychus, and Trophimus from the province of Asia. They went on ahead and waited for us in Troas. After the Passover ended, we boarded a ship at Philippi in Macedonia, and 5 days later joined them in Troas, where we stayed a week. And then we'll talk about that we there. On the first day of the week, we gathered with the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching to them, and since he was leaving the next day, he kept talking until midnight. The upstairs room where we met was lighted with many flickering lamps. As Paul spoke on and on, a young man named Eutychus, I think is how you say his name, sitting on the window, became very drowsy. Finally, he fell sound asleep, and dropped 3 stories to his death below. Paul went down, bent over him, and took him up into his arms. "Don't worry," he said, "he's alive." Then they all went back upstairs, shared the Lord's Supper, and ate together. Paul continued talking to them until dawn, and then he left. Meanwhile, the young man was taken home alive and well, and everyone was greatly relieved. And so, just to go back to the beginning of this, and we'll talk about the end as well. Um, from Macedonia, Paul traveled down to Greece, which would have been Corinth, in the province of Achaia, and he stayed there for 3 months. And we know that from 2 Corinthians 13. And this is probably where he wrote the book of Romans during that time. And again, like, we're doing this in chronological order, so that's why we stopped in between these 2 verses, between verse 2 and 3, and um, study the book of Romans. Because again, I want you to understand and get a feel for how things played out. And so we see that Paul would have, went down to Corinth, stayed there for 3 months, and this is where he wrote the book of Romans. So we want to see that transition and see everything happen as it happened chronologically. And so, um, like I said here, also, right. So he wrote Romans during this time while he was in Corinth for 3 months. He also, when he started traveling again, we start seeing in these verses it starts transition from to we. Luke, who is writing the Acts, starts saying we now. And so Luke apparently joined Paul at Philippi, where Luke had remained several years earlier, because it stopped from we to back. And so, and journeyed with him and Paul to Jerusalem. So we'll see that in chapters 21, see that a little bit more. And so he talks about them meeting and gathering on the first day of the week. The early church commemorated and remembered Jesus. They met on the first day of the week because that's when Jesus' resurrection was. Now, some people have taken this to the point of making this like a command, saying we have to because the early church met on the first day of the week, then we have to. And clearly we see Jesus talks about it. Paul talks about it in his letter to the Romans. Like, no day is holier than the other. It doesn't matter when you worship God. Um, Nothing wrong with doing it on the first day of the week, and it's become our tradition. And because that was when Jesus rose from the dead, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, obviously, most of the churches in America and around the world do that. But if you don't, right? I know there's some churches who meet on Saturdays and stuff like that. It doesn't matter when they do it. It's just that we do it. And so again, it's a good standard. We've been doing it for thousands of years, meeting on the first day of the week, but it's not a requirement. And if a church doesn't do it, then there's nothing wrong with that. I just want to throw that in there a little bit. Also, they shared in the Lord's Supper, and this is something that we do, and a lot of churches do. Is it doesn't say they did it every single Sunday that they met. It just said that this when they met together that they shared the Lord's Supper. Now we do it every Sunday, and more than likely, if you go back to the early part of Acts, they did it almost every time they met. Um, but the literal wording here is broke bread. But this is breaking bread was gathering uh, to partake in the Lord's Supper to remember the death of Jesus Christ, and so we see that, in Acts. They did it early on, almost every time they met, but it seems like as they we get it later into Acts, it seems like now again it's not 100% clear that they only did it whenever they met on the first day of the week, which was on Sundays. And so we still practice these same things. We still meet on Sundays. Most churches do. We still take the communion every single Sunday. We just think it's important to do that. I know there's some churches that don't, and that's okay. But we just think it's that important because that's what we're there for, and we see that pattern that's something the early church did. It seemed like every time they met together, they took it, and so we just continue to feel that. I'm not going to harp on anyone who doesn't, but I just think it's really really important, and it's something that we should do. So again, I just wanted to hit on those 2 points that we see that's pointed out there, and so like I said, this was Paul's last trip to Troas. And so he did gather with them to partake in the Lord's Supper when they did or to break bread literally on the first day of the week there. And so this meal also, I meant to throw this in here, was probably the communion and just a common meal. And that was a very normal thing that they would do too, is they would have their communion meal, and then they would have a common meal as well as part of that. They were kind of, they would have one and then transition into the other, whereas we just have ours. Obviously, it's a little bit different. Theirs was a little bit more ceremonial, I think, than ours is, and it was more like a meal than it was just like what we do is pass around some crackers and some juice. Um, Theirs would have been their normal unleavened bread and wine, and it would have been more of a meal type situation around a table versus how we do it today. But again, the idea it's not you know how we do it. It's more important is why and the meaning around it. And so I think that's important there. And so then the last thing we see here is the remarkable the remarkable raising of the dead of the guy who Paul. The way they would have done this is unlike us, where we start our days in the morning. They would have started their first day of the week on the actual sunset. And so for us, it still would have been Saturday. So literally, if you did it on our timetable, they actually were meeting Saturday night, not Sunday. But the way they did things, it would have been considered the first day of the week because their first day of the week would have started at sunset on Saturday. And so we need to understand that because people are like, well, why were they, meeting all night? And so, a lot of times these guys would have come in from the fields, from working, and gone straight to this on that day. Like not a lot of them weren't like us. They didn't have the Saturdays off. They basically worked every day except for Sunday, which was was their Sabbath a lot of times for the people around there. And so they would have started this, like I said, at sunset at any time. I don't remember. I don't know if I can recall what time of the year it was. So I mean, again, depending on what time of the year it was, it could have been 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, but at the latest, probably 8 or 9. And so we see that they met, and this is when they started meeting. So technically, if we wanted to follow their pattern, we'd start meeting on Saturday nights. But and so then he preached all night into the morning, and so this was part of that. And so because of that, right, I don't think Paul's teaching was boring and put this guy to sleep. I think what had happened, right, he'd probably been up all day. It was nighttime. He leaned up against the windowsill, lights flickering. Paul was speaking late into the night, and he fell out the window. He fell asleep and fell back out of the window. Paul goes down and raises him from the dead, and then they go back up, and then he keeps on and speaking until morning. And so that's kind of an interesting part of the story that we see there is most people probably like let's call it a night, but no, went back up and they continued on listening to Paul teach and preach. And so again, I wanted to throw that in there, and because a lot of times I see people and I see churches take, like, they see this part of the scripture and it's like, they don't fully understand the timeline around it, but they make these things commands. It's like, well, they did this, so we have to do this, and there's nothing that says that, right? This is just Luke saying this is what the church did, this is what we did. Now, there's nothing wrong with imitating the early church. We should as much as we can, but it not to the point where it's like, so like, just because they did something, we have to do it that way. That wasn't a command, right? We are commanded to worship God. We are commanded to take the Lord's Supper, but there's never given a time stamp of when you have to do it on this day or this time. Because, like I said, technically, if we wanted to follow and we have to follow this, then we have to do it starting on Saturday night at sunset. And so, again, like, we don't want to get that technical with things. We want to imitate and be like the early church, but we don't have to be exact copies of them. I hope that makes sense. And so, again, it's important to understand the things they did and to imitate and do do similar things that they did, but we don't have to do it to a T so much, because if you get into that, you get back into almost like a Pharisaic attitude of the law and the things we do being more important than why we're doing it, why we are doing it, and the heart around why we're doing it. So I hope that makes sense. Hope you understand that. I just wanted to kind of throw that little piece in there. So, well, we'll continue on. Paul's going to uh, go to Ephesians tomorrow. We'll look at that. He's going to travel to Ephesus and meet with the Ephesian elders. And as always, I hope you're learning from these. Going into Acts, and just hope this is more historical stuff than it is theological stuff. With the book of Acts, this is just more of a, okay, this is what we did, right, and more of a story of it. Like, that's why it's called Acts. It's the Acts of the apostles, the Acts of the church, the early church. We're going to continue to see these things. And like I said, it's good things for us to follow as an example in a lot of them. Not always are things that we have to do as the church, but it's important to understand and see what the early church did. So again, this is more of a historical book, history book, than it is, a lot of commands, especially the later part of Acts. And we'll get into that, but I think it's important to study that and see what they did, so we can learn from it and understand it and mimic it as well. So as always, appreciate everyone who takes time to watch these, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.